On the second morning of June 1817, Margaret Ashworth, a vicar's orphan daughter kept as an unpaid companion for 10 years, arrived at Rothmere House to be married, and was directed, as always, toward the servants' entrance at the rear. The Fenwick family, who held her father's debt and her future in their hands, had made certain every guest of consequence was watching. Everyone assumed the new Duchess of Rothmere would arrive through the back like the poor relation she had always been. What the Duke did instead, striding past his own footman to throw open both front doors with his bare hands, would be spoken of in 3 counties for the rest of the season. Margaret had learned the rear passage of every great house in the county by the time she was 20. She knew which door required a firm shoulder and which stuck in the rain, knew the particular smell of the Fenwick scullery at dawn, tallow and boiled linen, because Mrs. Fenwick had decided a decade earlier that a girl whose father died owing money had no business walking where paying guests walked. She had stopped arguing the point by her 17th year. Arguing only earned her a longer list of chores and a colder supper, and Margaret had grown skilled at swallowing things whole rather than choking on them in front of Louisa, who watched her cousin's humiliations with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had never once been asked to use a servant's stare. The marriage itself had been arranged in a solicitor's office with less ceremony than the sale of a horse. Edmund Hale had read the terms aloud in a flat voice, the £300 her father owed, Reginald's debts to a moneylender named Crake that threatened to take the roof from over the whole Fenwick family, and the Duke of Rothmere's offer to settle both in exchange for a wife who would ask him no questions and expect no affection. Margaret had signed without looking up. She told herself it was simply an extension of the life she already led, trading one house of obligation for another, larger one. She did not yet understand that the man she had agreed to marry had spent the better part of a month quietly asking questions about her, in kitchens and stable yards where no one thought to lie to him. On the drive to Rothmere House that final morning, Louisa had leaned across the carriage to remind her, one last time, which door she was to use, as though 10 years of the same instruction might somehow have slipped Margaret's mind. Mrs. Fenwick had smiled the small, satisfied smile she wore whenever she felt certain of a thing. They had arranged to arrive early enough to watch. What none of them had accounted for was a duke who had already given his household a single, quiet order the night before, an order his staff found so strange they repeated it to each other twice to be certain they had heard correctly, and which not one of them would disobey. Margaret Ashworth had learned, in the 10 years since her father's death, that a house could be measured not by its rooms but by its doors, and which of them a person was permitted to use. At Cardwell Grange there were 4 doors that mattered. The great oak double doors at the front, flanked by stone lions, opened only for the Fenwicks and their invited guests. The garden doors opened for anyone carrying flowers or good news. The side door, half hidden by ivy, opened for the vicar on his weekly calls. And at the rear, past the kitchen gardens and the coal store, there was the tradesman's door, low and unpainted, its hinges kept oiled by a groundskeeper who never once looked Margaret in the eye when she passed through it. She had been 8 years old when Mrs. Fenwick first pointed her toward that door, the week after Reverend Thomas Ashworth was buried in the churchyard at Little Cardwell, his modest estate revealed, upon reading of the will, to owe the Fenwick family £300 he had borrowed against a bad harvest and never lived to repay. Mrs. Fenwick had not raised her voice when she explained the new arrangement to the girl standing very straight in her mourning black. A debt was a debt, she said, and family was family, and Margaret would want for nothing so long as she remembered which she was. Margaret had not understood then that want and welcome were not the same thing, and that a person could be housed and fed and clothed for a decade and never once be asked to sit at the good end of the table. She understood it now. She was 26, and she had made a study of it the way other women made a study of music or French, learning exactly how many inches of hallway belonged to her, exactly which chairs in the drawing room she might occupy without comment, exactly how to enter a room so that no one noticed she had entered it at all. The tradesman's door had become, over the years, less an insult than a kind of shorthand, a reminder issued each morning before she had even finished dressing. She used it to fetch the post. She used it to return from church, because Mrs. Fenwick did not care to have a poor relation observed walking up the front steps beside her own daughter. She used it on the morning she was sent, basket over her arm, to deliver baskets to tenants poorer than herself, an errand that struck her, some years, as very close to comedy, though she had stopped laughing at it long before she turned 20. What she had not stopped doing was noticing. She noticed the exact moment Louisa's temper shifted, the particular silence that meant a scolding was coming rather than a request, the difference between Mrs. Fenwick's company voice and the flat, arithmetic tone she used when totaling the household accounts, a tone Margaret had learned to dread more than shouting because it meant she herself was being weighed against some column of figures only her aunt could see. It was Louisa who made the arithmetic personal, where her mother kept it abstract. Louisa Fenwick was 28, handsome in the way that money makes a woman handsome, and she had never forgiven Margaret for the small, unfair accident of resembling her late mother, whose portrait still hung in the vicarage that no longer belonged to anyone in Margaret's family. Louisa found new ways, season after season, to remind her cousin of the shape of things. She would ask Margaret to retrim a bonnet the night before a ball and then wear it herself. She would praise Margaret's needlework in front of guests, only to add, a beat later, that it was a fortunate thing Margaret had a useful skill, given her circumstances. She would say, with the particular gentleness she reserved for cruelty, that she did hope Margaret didn't mind being asked to sit with the children again this evening, as though minding were a luxury Margaret's 300 pounds had long since purchased out of her. Margaret minded. She simply did not let it show, because she had learned that showing it cost more than the insult itself, invited a second one, sharper, meant to test whether the first had truly landed. So she had built, brick by brick over 10 years, a particular kind of composure, not the composure of a woman who felt nothing, but the composure of a woman who had decided which feelings she could afford. It was this composure, more than her narrow waist or her quick hands, that made the household forget she was in a room at all, which was, she had come to understand, its own kind of protection. On a wet Tuesday in early October, that protection was tested by something new. A footman brought the Morning Post into the breakfast room as he always did, laying it beside Mrs. Fenwick's plate in its usual small stack, and among the household bills and a letter from Mrs. Fenwick's sister in Bath was a single sealed envelope bearing the return direction of a solicitor's office in London, a firm whose name Margaret did not recognize but whose paper, thick and cream-colored, was plainly more expensive than anything else on the table. Mrs. Fenwick set down her teacup without drinking from it. She read the letter once, quickly, her eyes moving fast across the lines the way they did when she was calculating a sum in her head. Then, unusually, she read it again, more slowly, and Margaret watched her aunt's face do something Margaret had rarely seen it do in 10 years, which was change. Not soften, precisely. Sharpen, perhaps, the way a face sharpens when it has been handed a fact it must now decide how to use. Mrs. Fenwick folded the letter along its original creases, rose from the table without a word to either daughter or niece, crossed to the small writing desk in the corner of the breakfast room, and locked it inside the top drawer with the little brass key she wore always on a ribbon at her waist. Louisa asked, lightly, who it was from. Mrs. Fenwick said it was nothing that concerned her, and reached for the teapot as though the matter were already closed, though her hand, Margaret noticed, was not quite steady on the handle. No one told Margaret what the letter had contained, and she had long since trained herself not to ask questions that would only be answered with a reminder of her place. But the household changed in small ways over the following fortnight, ways only someone who had spent a decade reading its weather could have noticed. Mrs. Fenwick began meeting privately with Edmund Hale, the family's solicitor, in the estate office rather than the drawing room, a distinction that mattered because the drawing room was for social calls and the office was for business no one wished overheard. Reginald Fenwick, Louisa's brother, who had been away in London for most of the autumn, returned to Cardwell Grange looking thinner than Margaret remembered, his coat a fraction too fashionable for a man who flinched, she noticed, whenever a servant announced a visitor. He drank more at dinner than he used to and said less. Louisa, for her part, grew watchful in a way that had nothing to do with Margaret at all, glancing at her mother across the table as though trying to read a letter written in a language she had never quite learned. It was into this uneasy quiet that word arrived, on a grey Thursday, that the Duke of Rothmere would be calling at Cardwell Grange the following morning to inspect certain matters pertaining to the estate's finances, a visit Mrs. Fenwick announced at dinner, with the particular brightness she used when she wanted a thing to sound like good fortune, rather than what it likely was, which was scrutiny. Margaret had heard of the Duke of Rothmere the way one heard of weather in a distant county, as a fact rather than a presence. He was said to be cold. He was said to be rich beyond the ordinary reckoning of dukes, his lands running along 3 counties, his house said to have 2 front doors of black lacquered oak that opened, so the story went, for no one but royalty. He was said, in the lower and more interesting register of servants' gossip that reached even a poor relation's ears, to have buried a wife 3 years past, under circumstances no one discussed above a whisper, and to have grown, since then, into a man who did not attend balls, did not pay calls, and did not, as a rule, involve himself in the private finances of families 3 counties removed from his own, unless something had made it worth his while. That he was coming to Cardwell Grange at all told Margaret, who had learned to read absences as carefully as presences, that Reginald's thinness and Mrs. Fenwick's locked drawer and the cream-colored letter from London were all, somehow, the same story. She was given no role in the visit beyond the ordinary one, which was to make herself useful and invisible in whichever order the day required, and so on the morning the Duke's carriage was expected, she was in the stable-yard before 9, sent to fetch a basket of eggs from the hen-house beyond it, her hands already cold in her thin gloves, her mind on nothing more significant than the mud along the path and whether her hem would survive it. The Duke's carriage arrived earlier than announced, black-lacquered and drawn by 4 matched bays, and it was still turning into the stable-yard when a boy's cry cut through the ordinary morning noise, high and frightened, coming from the hayloft above the stalls. Margaret did not stop to think. She dropped the basket, eggs and all, and was already moving toward the ladder before the stable-master had finished turning toward the sound, before Reginald, standing near the carriage to receive their guest, had done more than pale. Old Peter Dunmore's grandson, a boy of perhaps 6 who spent his mornings trailing his grandfather through the stables, had climbed higher into the loft than his short legs could safely manage, chasing a barn cat along a beam, and now hung from the loft's open edge by both hands, his feet scrambling uselessly against the stone wall below him, 15 feet of empty air beneath his boots. Margaret reached the base of the ladder as he lost his grip. She did not climb it, with no time. She threw herself instead directly beneath where he fell, catching enough of his weight across her arms and shoulder to break the worst of it, the 2 of them going down together into a loose pile of straw someone had left stacked against the stall wall, the boy shrieking more from fright than injury, Margaret's own breath knocked half out of her, her bonnet gone, her sleeve torn at the seam. She was on her knees beside him within a second of landing, running her hands quickly and competently along his arms and legs the way she had learned to do for tenant children during 10 years of parish visiting, checking for the give of a break before she checked for tears, finding none, and only then allowing herself to sit back in the straw and breathe. It was several seconds before she became aware that the yard had gone entirely silent around her, and several more before she understood why. A man she did not recognize was standing quite close, closer than propriety strictly allowed, having crossed the yard from his carriage faster than anyone else present, and was looking down at her with an expression she could not immediately name, something between astonishment and a kind of careful, deliberate stillness, as though he were memorizing the scene rather than reacting to it. He was tall, dressed with the plain severity of a man who did not need ornament to announce his consequence, his dark coat unmarked by any crest, and it was only the way the Fenwick footman had gone rigid, the way Reginald had turned the color of old parchment, that told Margaret, straw still caught in her disordered hair, exactly whose eyes were on her. She did not curtsy. There was a child in her lap and eggs broken across the cobblestones, and her sleeve was torn, and it did not occur to her, in that first unguarded moment, that any of it mattered more than making certain the boy was truly unhurt. The Duke of Rothmere said nothing at all. He simply watched, with an attention that felt, to Margaret, entirely unlike being looked at by anyone else in that yard for the whole of the 10 years she had lived in it, while old Peter Dunmore came running at last, calling his grandson's name, and the ordinary business of the morning resumed around the 2 of them, like water closing over a stone. Edmund Hale's office in the market town of Alresford smelled of beeswax and old paper, and Margaret had been made to sit in the hardest chair, facing the window, while the Fenwicks arranged themselves along the good side of the desk, as though the summons had been issued for their comfort rather than hers. Mrs. Fenwick had said only that Mr. Hale wished to discuss a matter arising from the late Reverend Ashworth's affairs, and Margaret had spent the carriage ride turning the phrase over, certain it meant some new deduction against the debt she had spent 10 years failing to work off, some fresh sum invented to keep her exactly where she was. She had not expected Hale to clear his throat twice, glance at a paper he had clearly already memorized, and say that the Duke of Rothmere had made an offer of marriage, contingent upon the full and immediate settlement of the Ashworth debt, and the whole of Reginald Fenwick's obligation to a moneylender named Josiah Crake. The room did not move for a long moment. Louisa's fan, which she had been working with the brisk irritation of a woman enduring a tedious errand, stopped mid-stroke. Mrs. Fenwick's face performed a small, private arithmetic that Margaret could read as clearly as if she had spoken it aloud. The debt gone, Reginald's disgrace paid off, and the cousin who had cost the household nothing but her keep for a decade, suddenly the answer to every ledger line that had troubled her sleep. Margaret herself felt strangely absent from the moment, as though she were watching it happen to someone else through a pane of glass, and it was several seconds before she understood that Hale was waiting for her to speak, that the terms as he had read them required her answer and no one else's. "There is no promise of affection in the contract," Hale said, not unkindly, "only precisely, as a man reads out the clauses he is bound to disclose. His Grace has been plain about that. It is a marriage of settlement, and the terms are otherwise generous." Margaret looked at her own hands in her lap, folded so tightly the knuckles had gone pale, and understood that generous was the word the world would use for it, and that no one in the room, least of all her, was going to ask what she wanted, because the sum owed to the Fenwicks and the sum owed to Crake had already answered the question for her. She said yes. She said it quietly, without inflection, the same voice she used to accept a task or a correction, and she watched Louisa's face contort through 3 separate expressions before settling on a thin, brittle smile that did not reach anywhere near her eyes. The Fenwicks did not linger once the essential business was concluded. Mrs. Fenwick rose first, smoothing her skirts with the satisfaction of a woman who had just watched an old debt cancel itself without a single farthing leaving her own purse, and murmured something about informing the housekeeper of the change in arrangements, as though Margaret's marriage were a matter of linen closets and place settings, rather than the whole shape of her life turned over in a single afternoon. Louisa followed her mother to the door, but paused at the threshold and looked back at Margaret with an expression that was almost, for one unguarded instant, something like hurt, before it hardened again into the familiar contempt she wore the way other women wore jewelry. "A duke," she said, to no one in particular, as though testing how the word tasted in a sentence that was not about herself. Reginald said nothing at all. He had gone the color of tallow the moment Crake's name was spoken, and he left the room without meeting anyone's eyes, his relief too raw and too shameful to display in company. When the door had closed behind them and the sound of the Fenwick carriage wheels had begun to fade against the wet cobbles outside, Margaret remained seated, and Hale, who had been shuffling his papers into a neat and unnecessary stack, seemed to sense that she was not yet ready to be shown out. She asked him finally, the question she had been holding since the moment he read the terms aloud: why a duke? A man who could have his pick of every eligible woman in 3 counties, women with fortunes and connections, and nothing to recommend against them, would choose instead a penniless companion he had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with in a stable yard. Hale set down his pen and considered her for a moment with something that might have been sympathy, or might only have been the professional caution of a man who did not like to speculate beyond his instructions. "His Grace gave no reason, Miss Ashworth," he said at last. "Only a list of terms, delivered in writing, and a date by which he required my answer. I have acted for the Rothmere family 11 years, and I have never known him to explain himself to anyone, least of all to me." The words settled into the quiet room and stayed there, unanswered, and Margaret understood that she was to be married within the month to a man whose reasons were entirely his own, and that she would learn them, if she learned them at all, only by living beside him long enough to earn the telling. Rothmere House by daylight was nothing like the impression its master had left in the Cardwell stable yard. Where the Duke himself seemed carved from restraint, the house sprawled in a confident sunlit grandeur, its pale stone front catching the October light across a dozen tall windows, its front drive raked to a gravel so fine it crunched like sugar underfoot. Margaret was brought there a fortnight before the wedding, ostensibly to be fitted for clothing befitting a duchess, though she suspected, from the careful way the housekeeper avoided the front steps and led her instead along a side path to a servant's entrance, out of long habit rather than instruction, that no one in the household yet knew quite what to make of her. She was measured by a modiste summoned from London, stood for hours in a cold morning room while pins were set and fabrics debated over her head as though she were a piece of furniture being reupholstered, and it was in the middle of this that Lady Cassandra Vane, the Duke's mother, entered without announcement and studied Margaret for a long moment with an expression of frank, unhurried assessment. She was a tall woman, silver-haired, dressed in unrelieved dark blue, and she did not smile, But neither did she look away, which Margaret had come to understand, after 10 years under Mrs. Fenwick's roof, was its own kind of rare courtesy. "So you are the one," Lady Cassandra said, more to herself than to Margaret, and then, after a pause that seemed to weigh something invisible, added only, "We shall see." She left as abruptly as she had come, and the modiste resumed her pinning as though nothing at all had happened, but Margaret felt the encounter settle into her chest like a held breath, uncertain whether she had passed some test or merely been given the opportunity to fail a later one. The fitting continued into the afternoon, bolt after bolt of fabric finer than anything Margaret had touched since her mother's death, and she found herself struggling to reconcile the plain, careful economy of her whole adult life with the casual abundance being measured onto her shoulders, as though the two Margarets, the one who mended gloves by candlelight and the one now standing in silk, could not possibly be the same woman. When the fitting ended and the modiste had packed away her pins and chalk, Margaret was given leave to wait in a small parlor while the carriage was readied to return her to Cardwell Grange, and it was restlessness more than curiosity that carried her down an unfamiliar corridor in the west wing, past a row of closed doors that seemed older and quieter than the rest of the house, as though that whole section had been left to its own silence. She found herself before a set of double doors at the corridor's end, taller than the others, and through a narrow gap where the heavy drapes covering their glass panels had not been drawn quite closed, she glimpsed the edge of a gilt frame, and within it, the pale curve of a woman's shoulder rendered in oil, a face turned 3/4 from the light. She had leaned closer, drawn by nothing more than the ordinary pull of an unanswered question, when a housemaid rounded the corner with an armful of linen and stopped so abruptly that a pillow slip slid to the floor. "Miss, you oughtn't be here," the girl said, her voice pitched low and urgent in a way that had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with fear, and she took Margaret's elbow with a familiarity the situation did not strictly permit, and steered her firmly back the way she had come. Margaret asked, only to make conversation, what portrait lay behind the locked doors, and the housemaid's grip tightened for just a moment before she answered, not unkindly, that it was not Margaret's business to ask, and that the room stayed locked on the housekeeper's own orders, had stayed locked 3 years now. They walked on in silence until they had nearly reached the main stair, and it was only there, glancing back once to be certain they were not overheard, that the girl leaned close and said, in a rush, as though the words had been waiting a long time for permission to leave her, that the last Duchess had never once used the front doors either, not in all her years at Rothmere House, though she would not say. When Margaret opened her mouth to ask why, because at that exact moment the housekeeper's voice rang out from the floor below calling the girl's name, sharp and displeased, and she was gone down the servants' stair before Margaret could form the question properly, leaving her standing alone at the top of the grand staircase, with a single unfinished sentence, and the whole bright, silent house around her. The great hall of Rothmere House stood emptied of its ordinary business by 9 that evening. Chairs pushed back against the walls, the long table where the staff took their instructions cleared of everything but a single branch of candles. Margaret was not present. She had been sent early to her rooms in the east wing, and so she never saw what passed in that hall, though she would hear of it, in pieces, for weeks afterward, from housemaids who still spoke of it in lowered voices. The Duke came down at 9:30, dressed as he had been at dinner, and stood before his assembled household with his hands clasped behind him in the manner the footman had learned meant he intended to speak, and did not wish to be prompted. He said that the wedding would proceed at 11 the following morning, that the carriage from Cardwell Grange was expected by 10:30, and that when it arrived both front doors were to be opened. Not the near one, as was customary for ordinary guests. Both. Thrown wide together, and held so, by his own hand. The housekeeper, a narrow woman named Mrs. Pruitt who had run the house for 11 years and had opinions about very little that she voiced aloud, allowed herself a small intake of breath that carried the length of the hall. The butler, Simmons, who had served the family since the old Duke's time, stepped forward and asked, in the careful tone of a man confirming an order rather than questioning it, whether His Grace meant the doors were to be opened by the footman as usual, with himself merely present to receive the bride. The Duke said no, he meant to open them himself, with his own hands, before any footman touched the latch. Simmons said nothing further, but something moved behind his eyes, some calculation completing itself, and he inclined his head and said only, "Very well, Your Grace," in the tone of a man filing away a fact of considerable weight. A younger footman near the back, new enough to the house that he did not yet know what he did not know, leaned toward the maid beside him and asked in a whisper what was so remarkable about a duke opening his own doors. The maid did not answer him. She was watching Simmons's face, and Simmons was watching the duke, and neither of them explained anything, because explaining it would have meant saying aloud what everyone above the rank of scullery maid already understood, that Rothmere House's front doors, both leaves of black lacquered oak thrown open together, had not moved on their hinges in that fashion since the last Duchess arrived as a bride herself, more than 20 years before, on the arm of the old Duke's father. When the staff had been dismissed and the hall had emptied of all but the last drifting candle smoke, the Duke did not go up to his own chambers as the household expected. He crossed instead to his study, a narrow room at the end of the north corridor that his mother rarely entered, and his valet knew to leave undisturbed after 10 in the evening, and he locked the door behind him, though there was no one left awake in that part of the house to intrude. He sat for a long while without lighting more than the single lamp already burning on the desk, and from the bottom drawer, the one that stuck slightly in damp weather and had stuck that night, he drew out a letter folded into quarters and softened at the creases from having been folded and unfolded more times than any letter ought to bear. He did not open it. He held it, turning it once in his hands the way a man turns a coin he no longer expects to spend, and set it on the blotter before him, and looked at it as though it might, on this particular night, say something it had not said on any of the nights before. It was not a letter from Margaret. She had written him nothing yet, not so much as a note of thanks for the gowns or the carriage sent to fetch her for the fitting, and he had not expected one. This letter was 3 years old, its ink gone the color of weak tea at the folds, and he had read it exactly once, on the morning it arrived, and never again, though he had carried it from London to Rothmere House and back a dozen times since, unable to burn it and unwilling to answer it. He sat with it until the candle had burned down by a full inch, and then he folded it once more, smaller than before, and returned it to the drawer, and turned the small brass key in the lock with the particular care of a man securing something he did not trust himself to look at twice in one night. He rose, straightened his coat though no one would see him do it, and stood a moment at the window that overlooked the carriage drive and the two dark shapes of the front doors below, closed now, ordinary, waiting. Tomorrow, he thought, and did not finish the thought in words, because some things a man did not permit himself to say even alone in a locked room, even to no one, even in the dark. The morning came gray and mild, with a low mist still clinging to the hedgerows when the Fenwick carriage set out from Cardwell Grange a little before 10. Mrs. Fenwick had dressed with more care than the occasion of another woman's wedding strictly required, in a bonnet trimmed with the last of her good ribbon, and she had positioned herself in the carriage so that she might see Margaret's face clearly across the narrow space between the seats. Louisa sat beside her mother, resplendent in a shade of green she had chosen specifically because it did not appear in Margaret's borrowed wardrobe, and she spent the first half of the journey in silence, watching the hedges pass, before she could no longer contain herself. "You will remember," Louisa said, not troubling to soften it, "that whatever grand notions you have taken on since your fitting, you are still received at a house as a poor relation is received, and the tradesman's door will be no different at Rothmere than it was at home, only larger, I should think, given the size of the place." Mrs. Fenwick did not correct her daughter, which was its own kind of answer, and Margaret, seated with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the window, said nothing at all, because she had learned across 10 years that silence cost her less than argument and settled nothing either way. She had almost come to believe it herself, that rule, so thoroughly had it been repeated to her since childhood that it had stopped feeling like cruelty and had simply become the shape of the world, the way a stone in a shoe stops registering as pain and becomes only weight. The carriage turned at last up the long avenue of lime trees that led to Rothmere House, and Margaret saw the house rise ahead of them through the thinning mist, pale stone and tall windows catching what little sun there was, and she felt her stomach tighten not with anticipation, but with the old, familiar bracing she had learned before every arrival at every great house that was not, and never would be, her own. She did not look for the rear entrance. She had stopped needing to look. Her feet knew the way a servant's feet know a back stair, without conscious thought, and she had already begun, in her mind, the small internal preparation of a woman readying herself to walk around the side of a house on her own wedding day. The carriage did not slow at the turning that led around toward the servants' court, and for a moment Margaret assumed the coachman had simply misjudged the drive, unfamiliar as he was with the grounds. But Louisa's sharp intake of breath beside her told her otherwise before her own eyes confirmed it. The carriage rolled instead straight up the main sweep of gravel and drew to a stop directly before the wide stone steps and the two front doors of black lacquered oak, and there, standing at the top of those steps with his household arrayed behind him in two silent rows, Simmons and Mrs. Pruitt, and every footman and maid in their best dark uniforms, stood the Duke of Rothmere, who had not sent a servant to greet his own bride but had come down himself. Margaret's hand had already reached for the carriage door before the footman could open it, an old habit of not waiting to be served that she had never managed to unlearn, and when she stepped down onto the gravel, she saw the Duke descend two of the steps to meet her, and then, before she had taken more than 3 steps toward the house, he turned from her entirely and crossed to the doors themselves, and took hold of the great iron handle of the left leaf in one hand and the right in the other, and threw them both open together, wide, with his own hands, so that the sound of them swinging back against the stone rang out across the whole silent forecourt like something struck. No footman touched them. No one else moved at all. Louisa had gone the color of old paper, standing frozen halfway out of the carriage with one gloved hand still gripping its frame, and Mrs. Fenwick's mouth had opened slightly and stayed that way, and behind them the coachman himself had turned on his box to stare, because even a hired man could read what was being said in that gesture, wordlessly, to every person watching from the drive. The Duke turned back to Margaret and extended his hand, not toward the side of the house, not toward any door but this one, the one reserved by the whole unspoken grammar of great houses for royalty and for reigning duchesses and, 20 years before, for a bride very much like her, and he said nothing to explain himself to the Fenwicks at all, because he had not opened those doors for their benefit, and every line of his still, deliberate posture made that plain without a single word spoken in their direction. The chapel at Rothmere House held perhaps 40 people, and every one of them had been chosen by the Duke's own hand rather than left to the Fenwicks' guest list, a fact Louisa noted with a tight jaw the moment she counted the empty pews where her own particular friends should have sat. There were no garlands of the white roses Mrs. Fenwick had suggested by letter 3 weeks earlier, a suggestion answered only with silence. Instead, the altar held sprigs of rosemary and late lavender cut that morning from the kitchen garden, tied with plain ribbon, arranged by Mrs. Pruitt's own hands rather than a hired florist from Winchester. Margaret noticed the rosemary first, its scent sharp and clean under the cooler smell of stone, and she would remember that smell for the rest of her life more clearly than she remembered the vicar's words. She stood at the altar rail in a gown the London modiste had made from ivory silk, plain by the standards of the ton, but finer than anything she had owned since her father's death, and beside her, the Duke stood with his hands loosely clasped, his face composed into the same unreadable stillness she had watched him wear in the stable yard, in Hale's office, on every front step she had ever seen him cross. Lady Cassandra sat in the front pew alone on the family's side, her spine straight, her gloved hands folded in her lap, watching her son with an expression Margaret could not read at that distance but would think of again before the day ended. When the vicar asked the Duke to repeat his vows, his voice did not rise, did not perform for the small audience the way she had heard bridegrooms perform at other weddings where she had stood at the back, near the door reserved for companions and poor relations. He spoke the words as though he were signing a deed, each one placed deliberately, and yet when he came to promise to cherish her, something in his voice caught for the length of half a breath, so brief that Margaret might have imagined it, except that Lady Cassandra's folded hands tightened in her lap at the exact same moment, as if she too had heard it, and understood something in it that Margaret did not yet. Margaret's own vows came out steadier than she had expected, though her heart beat so hard she was certain the whole chapel must hear it. She had spent 10 years learning to make her voice small, to speak only when spoken to answer questions with the fewest words that would satisfy the asker, and it took a conscious effort now to let her voice fill the space allotted to it, to claim the sentence as her own, rather than offer it like an apology. When it was done, when the ring, a plain band of gold with no stone, no ostentation, nothing that would have drawn Louisa's covetous eye, sat cool and unfamiliar on her finger, the Duke did not kiss her in front of the assembled guests as custom permitted. He only looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary and inclined his head very slightly, a gesture so small that a stranger might have missed it entirely, But Margaret, who had spent a decade reading the smallest signals of a room to know where she was safe to stand, understood it as something closer to a bow than a nod, and something in her chest, some old cold knot she had carried since her father's grave, loosened by a fraction she had not expected. The wedding breakfast was laid in the smaller of Rothmere House's 2 dining rooms, a choice the Duke had made deliberately, Margaret would learn later, because the grand dining room seated 80, and he had wanted no one to remark upon how few guests filled it. Long windows looked out over the south lawn, still silvered with the last of the morning's rain, and the table was set with the Rothmere silver, plain and heavy, engraved only with a small crest near the rim, rather than the elaborate monogram Louisa had once described with envy after visiting a wealthier connection's home. Mrs. Fenwick sat near the middle of the table, her expression arranged into something like satisfaction now that the debt was settled and Reginald's obligations quietly absorbed, though her eyes still moved over the room's furnishings, with the calculating look of a woman assessing what she had lost the right to inherit through her own household. Louisa sat further down, in green, and it was perhaps 20 minutes into the meal, after the fish course, when she leaned toward Lady Cassandra with a smile that did not reach her eyes, and said that she supposed the household must find it a great adjustment. Taking in a duchess who had spent so many years assisting with the mending and the accounts rather than learning the management of a great house, that Margaret's education, she was sure, had been of a very different, very practical sort. The table went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone has heard an insult and is waiting to see who will answer it. Margaret felt the old reflex rise in her, the instinct to smooth the moment over, to laugh softly and change the subject and absorb the blow the way she had absorbed 1,000 smaller ones at Cardwell Grange, and she had actually opened her mouth to do exactly that when the Duke spoke first, his voice at its ordinary, unhurried pitch, no louder than it had been asking a footman to refill a glass. He said that Margaret had managed the accounts and correspondence of a household under considerable strain for the better part of a decade without a single ledger error, a fact he had confirmed himself from the very records Cardwell Grange's own solicitor had provided during the debt settlement, and that he was aware of no skill more practical, nor more difficult to teach a woman who had never wanted for anything than that. He did not raise his voice, he did not look at Louisa with anger, he simply stated it as a fact, the way he might have corrected an error in a surveyor's report, and then he returned his attention to his plate as though the matter were closed, which, at that table, it was. Louisa's face went the color of the wine in her glass, and she did not attempt another remark of that kind for the remainder of the meal. Margaret sat very still, her fork motionless above her plate, and understood in that moment, more clearly than she had understood anything since the front doors had opened for her that morning, that the wall the Duke kept around himself was not the absence of feeling the ton believed it to be. It was a door he chose, deliberately, when to open. The storm came in the 3rd week of November, sweeping up from the coast with a suddenness the local farmers had not predicted, and by mid-afternoon the rain had turned to something closer to a wall of water against Rothmere House's tall windows, loud enough that conversation in the drawing room required raised voices. Margaret had gone up to the West Wing that morning to fetch a book of household accounts she meant to review, a habit she had not abandoned even now that she was mistress of a house with a full staff of her own, and she was still there, seated on a narrow bench beneath a window, when the last of the light failed, and she realized the storm had made the return journey to the main house unwise. She had sent word by a passing housemaid rather than risk the exposed gallery corridor, and it was there, in the low light of a single branch of candles Mrs. Pruitt had sent up, that the Duke found her an hour later, having come himself rather than sending anyone else. He did not comment on the impropriety of the hour, or the isolation of the wing, or anything a stricter household might have remarked upon. He only stood for a long moment in the doorway, looking at the door across the corridor, the locked one, the one Margaret had passed a dozen times since her arrival, without ever again asking about the woman glimpsed once through a gap in the drapes. Then, without a word of explanation, he crossed to it, drew a small brass key from his waistcoat pocket, a key Margaret understood at once he had carried on his person rather than trusted to Mrs. Pruitt's ring, and turned it in the lock. The door swung open onto a room cold with disuse, dust sheeting the furniture, and at the far end, unveiled now, the portrait Margaret had seen only in fragments. A young woman, fair-haired, painted in the bright, confident style fashionable a decade earlier, smiling out from the canvas with an expression Margaret found she could not quite trust, though she could not have said why. The Duke stood before it for a long moment before he spoke, and when he did, his voice was lower than she had heard it, stripped of the flat control he wore in every room downstairs. He told her the woman's name was Constance, that she had been his wife for 4 years, and that she had died 3 years past this coming spring, not from illness or accident as the county had been permitted to assume, but in a carriage accident on the road from a neighboring estate where she had gone, that final week, to end an affair she had begun the previous autumn with a man who had once been counted among the Duke's closest friends from university. He said this without bitterness in his voice, which surprised Margaret more than the confession itself, and when she asked, carefully, why the county did not know the truth of it, he was quiet long enough that the rain against the windows filled the whole silence before he answered her at all. He told her the rest of it standing very still, his hands clasped behind his back in the posture she had come to recognize as the one he used when he most wanted to appear unmoved, and she had learned enough of him by now to understand that the posture meant the opposite. The man Constance had gone to meet, the friend from university, had a wife of his own and 2 young children, and in the days after the accident, when the coroner's inquiry might easily have uncovered the truth of where she had been riding and why, the Duke had made a choice that had cost him 3 years of the county's whispered judgment. He had said nothing. He had allowed the silence to stand, had allowed the ton to draw its own conclusions from his refusal to speak of the marriage, had let them decide for themselves that his coldness was guilt, or grief turned inward, or some private cruelty they could not name but were certain they had glimpsed, because the alternative was a public inquiry that would have ruined not only Constance's memory, but the lives of a woman and 2 children who had done nothing to deserve the destruction of their family alongside his own. He had absorbed the judgment of every drawing room in Hampshire rather than let anyone else pay for what his wife and his friend had done, and he had never, not once in 3 years, told another living soul the full truth of it until this hour, in this room, to her. Margaret stood very still herself, aware of the rain and the candlelight and the small distance between them, and found that what she felt was not pity, which she suspected he would have refused as readily as he had refused every other offer of comfort these 3 years, but something closer to recognition, the particular understanding of a person who has also learned to carry a weight silently because the alternative seemed to cost more than she could afford. She told him, quietly, that she understood now why he had asked no questions of her in Hale's office, why he had wanted only a contract and no promises she could not have kept honestly. He was quiet again, and then he said that he had chosen her, that day in the stable yard, in part because she had asked him for nothing, not comfort, not rescue, not even his name. She had simply acted, and he had watched her do it without a single thought for how it might be received or repaid. He said that in 3 years no one, not his mother, not Hale, not a single member of his own household, had asked him nothing of him the way she had asked him nothing that day, and that he found he did not know, now that she might ask him for anything at all, what she wanted. The question hung between them in the candlelit room, honest and unguarded in a way his voice had never once been downstairs, and Margaret, searching for an answer she had not permitted herself to reach for in 10 years of asking for nothing, found that she did not yet have the words for it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered not by post but by a man in a brown coat who would not give his name to Simmons and would not wait in the hall like any decent caller. Josiah Crake stood instead in the gravel drive beside a hired gig, his hat in his hands, his manner a peculiar mixture of servility and threat, as though he had rehearsed both and could not decide which to lead with. Behind him, half hidden by the gig's wheel, stood Reginald Fenwick, thinner than he had been at the wedding breakfast, his coat collar turned up though the morning was mild, his eyes fixed on the gravel rather than on the house. The Duke received Crake in the small front parlor rather than his study, a deliberate choice Margaret would later understand that kept the man near the door and far from anything he might mistake for welcome. She was not meant to be present for the interview, but she had been crossing the hall with Mrs. Pruitt when Crake's voice rose loud enough to carry, and she stopped, and did not pretend otherwise. Crake's complaint, stripped of its wrappings, was simple. He had accepted, through Hale's negotiation, a settlement of Reginald's debt at a figure well below what he claimed the total to be, and he had signed the release only because Hale had implied, Crake insisted, that further business might follow between his office and the Duke's. No further business had come. Crake had decided, in the weeks since, that he had been cheated of the difference, and he had arrived to collect it in a currency other than coin. He suggested, without quite saying it outright, that certain particulars of Miss Ashworth's conduct during her years at Cardwell Grange, particulars he claimed to have gathered from persons willing to speak for a price, might prove uncomfortable if repeated in the right drawing rooms before the season resumed. He did not say what these particulars were. He did not need to. The shape of the threat was clear enough without specifics. A threat aimed not at Margaret's purse, which held nothing, but at the one thing marriage to a duke could not fully purchase back for a woman who had spent a decade being talked about. Margaret felt the old cold settle into her chest, the particular stillness she had trained into herself at Cardwell Grange whenever Louisa's voice sharpened in a room full of guests, and she understood, watching through the half-open parlor door, that some part of her had expected this, had known that a debt paid was not always a debt that stayed paid, not when the man being repaid measured his worth by how much fear he could still command. The Duke had not raised his voice. He had not, so far as Margaret could tell from the hall, moved from his chair. He asked Crake, in the same flat tone he had once used to correct Louisa at the breakfast table, whether he wished to repeat his suggestion in the presence of a magistrate, and Crake, misreading the question as an opening rather than a warning, said that he would be glad to, if the price were made worth his silence instead. What Crake had not accounted for, and what Margaret only understood later that evening when the Duke finally spoke of it to her directly, was that Hale had never stopped his inquiries into the moneylender's affairs, not once, not even after the settlement was signed and sealed. The Duke had suspected, from the very first meeting over Reginald's debts, that a man who lent at such punishing rates to a young gambler with no security beyond his sister's marriage prospects was unlikely to keep his books honest in every particular, and he had quietly instructed Hale, weeks before the wedding, to make discreet inquiry among Crake's other debtors in Hampshire and the neighboring counties. What Hale found, patiently gathered over those weeks through conversations in taverns and market days that never once mentioned the Duke's name, was a pattern of interest charged above the legal rate, of terms altered after signature, of at least 2 families driven from modest farms by debts that had been quietly doubled through methods no honest court would sanction. Crake, standing in the parlor and believing himself to hold the only leverage in the room, had no notion that the folder Hale kept locked in his Alresford office contained sworn statements from 3 separate men willing, now that the Duke of Rothmere's interest in the matter was known, to speak where they had been too frightened to speak before. The Duke let Crake finish his second, cruder threat, the one naming a price, before he answered, and his answer was not the payment Crake expected but a name, that of the county magistrate, and a date, the following Thursday, when Hale's evidence would be laid before him in full. He told Crake plainly that no sum would be paid, not for silence, not for anything, and that the choice before him now was whether to leave Rothmere House quietly and take whatever passage out of the county his remaining reputation could still buy him, or to remain and discover exactly how much protection his threats against a duchess had purchased him. Reginald, who had said nothing throughout, made a small strangled sound near the door, the sound of a man watching his own ruin arrive by a route he had not anticipated, tied as it now was to Crake's exposure rather than his rescue. It was the Duke's next words that changed the shape of the room entirely. He turned to Reginald directly, for the first time since the interview began, and said that the debts Crake had extracted from him, the true figures behind the padded ones, would be paid and closed within the week, freeing him entirely, on one condition only, that Reginald's name, and Margaret's, never again appear in the same sentence in any scheme he devised. Margaret, still in the hall, pressed her hand flat against the doorframe and found that what rose in her was not triumph exactly, though it was near enough to it, but something quieter, the strange vertigo of watching a debt that had shaped 10 years of her life dissolve in the space of a single unhurried conversation, while outside, unseen and unannounced, a carriage was already turning up the long gravel drive from the direction of Cardwell Grange. Louisa arrived the following morning without having sent word ahead, which was itself a kind of confession, for she had never in 10 years of visiting called on anyone without the correct interval of notice, the correct card left the correct number of days in advance. She came. Margaret understood the moment Simmons brought word of the carriage, because she had heard already, by whatever swift and merciless channel carried such news through the county, that her brother's disgrace and Crake's ruin had become common knowledge overnight, and that the marriage she had resented from the first announcement had somehow become the very instrument that exposed her family's shame to every drawing room she had once hoped to impress. Simmons stood in the doorway of the morning room where Margaret sat with her correspondence, his expression carefully neutral in the way of a man who had served the family long enough to know when neutrality was itself a kind of tact, and asked which entrance Mrs. Fenwick's daughter should be shown through. It was not an idle question. The household had watched, in the months since the wedding, as the front doors of Rothmere House were opened each morning for the new Duchess, as a matter of ordinary custom, no longer the singular gesture of one dramatic day, but the shape of her life now, and every servant below stairs understood precisely what those doors had once meant to the woman who had arrived through them for the first time as a bride. Simmons's question, put so plainly, carried inside it the whole history of the tradesman's door, the rule Mrs. Fenwick had invented and enforced for a decade, the daily small cruelty of it, and Margaret felt the weight of that history settle on her as she set down her pen. She thought, for a moment that stretched longer than the moment itself warranted, of every morning she had walked the gravel path around the side of Cardwell Grange to the servants' entrance, while guests she had once known as a child passed her without a glance through the front, of Louisa's voice in the carriage the morning of the wedding, reminding her one final time of a rule that no longer had any power to touch her. She thought too of what the Duke had told her in the portrait gallery, that he had chosen her because she asked nothing of anyone, and she understood now, with a clarity that felt less like a decision made than a fact finally recognized, that this moment asked something different of her than either forgiveness performed for its own sake or cruelty returned in kind. She rose from her writing desk and told Simmons, in a voice that surprised her with its steadiness, that Miss Fenwick was to be shown through the front doors, the same as any guest of the house. Louisa's face, when she stepped through the doors Simmons held open for her, betrayed for the briefest instant the same stunned arrest that had crossed Margaret's own features the morning of the wedding, though Louisa mastered it faster, or believed she did, smoothing her expression into something like the old careless composure before she had crossed half the entrance hall. But Margaret, who had spent 10 years reading the smallest shifts in her cousin's face for warning of what mood the day would bring, saw the effort it cost her, saw the way Louisa's eyes moved once, involuntarily, to the black lacquered wood of the doors themselves, as though searching them for some trick or condition she had not yet been told. There was no trick. Margaret received her in the same morning room, offered her the same chair by the window she would have offered any caller, and did not once mention Reginald, or Crake, or the years of the tradesman's door, or the mended dress, or any of the small accumulated cruelties that another woman, entitled to far more satisfaction than Margaret allowed herself, might have laid out one by one across the tea-table between them. She asked only after Mrs. Fenwick's health and listened to Louisa's stiff, brief answers and poured the tea herself rather than ringing for a servant to do it, a small, ordinary gesture that seemed, in the charged quiet of that room, to unsettle Louisa far more than any accusation could have. It was grace withheld from performance, offered instead as simple fact, the plain use of a front door for a woman who had once decided which doors Margaret was permitted to use, and Louisa left within the half hour, her composure fully restored by the time she reached her carriage, though she did not look back at the house as it pulled away, not once, down the long gravel drive. That evening, Margaret told the Duke of the visit, as they sat together in the small parlor that had become, in the months of their marriage, the room where the day's business was set down and left there, not carried further into the private hours that belonged only to the two of them. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said only that he was glad the doors had held their meaning even for a woman who did not deserve to receive it, and Margaret understood that this, too, was a kind of answer to the question he had asked her that stormy night in the portrait gallery, what she wanted now that she might ask for anything. She had not needed, in the end, to ask for revenge, or for acknowledgement, or for any of the 10 years' accounting Louisa had never once offered to settle. She had wanted, she realized only now, watching the last light fade beyond the tall windows, precisely this, an ordinary evening in a house whose doors opened for her without ceremony each morning because it was simply understood that they would. Later, alone for a moment at the top of the front steps while the Duke spoke with Simmons inside about some small matter of the household accounts, Margaret stood between the two open black lacquered doors as dusk settled over the drive, her hand resting lightly against the wood her husband had opened himself, with his own hands on the first morning she arrived as his wife, and watched the last trace of the Fenwick carriage recede into the blue distance beyond the gates, needing, at last, to say nothing to it at all.